That's what happens when there is no government, Mr. Speaker. We should reject these irresponsible, dangerous, and un-American amendments. They will shut down the government, and the American people, quite frankly, do not deserve this.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Labor HHS Subcommittee on Appropriations. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Kingston.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the speaker for the time, and want to say this, that we're here tonight on a continued debate over Obamacare for good reason. In fact, there's 3 reasons. Number one, health care is 1/6 of the economy. I think that before we turn over 1/6 of the economy to the federal government, we need to be very clear on the path that we're going on, and right now the path is anything but clear. In fact, to quote one of the leading Democrat architects from the Senate, Senator Baucus, he said, "It's a train wreck." So to me, to continue the debate on Obamacare is the proper thing to do. 1/6 of the economy, Mr. Speaker, think about that. Secondly, in terms of our health care system now, as flawed as it may be, it's still the best health care system in the world. Indeed, 40% of the medical tourists come to America for procedures and operations. You can't say that about any other country. And then number 3, Obamacare has failed. 2 of its objectives, the prime objectives, were number 1, to decrease the cost of health care, and number 2, to increase the access. And let's examine those. Do you know anybody whose health care premium has decreased this year? I've asked this question many, many times back home and on the floor of the House. And I've invited people to call my office if their premiums have in fact decreased. I haven't heard from an individual. I haven't heard from a business. I've talked to many businesses who've had 25% and 30% increases. My own daughter, a healthy 30-year-old's premium went from $170 a month to $270 a month. The premiums are not going down because the cost isn't going down. Obamacare has failed on that. Then number 2, and very important, the accessibility has not increased. 2 Fortune 500 companies in my home state of Georgia have announced the following. One says that they will no longer cover 15,000 spouses of their employees under their health care. Another one said, could I have another minute?
You'll the gentleman an extra minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 additional minute.
I thank the chairman. Another Fortune 500 company in Georgia has announced that 20,000 part-time employees will no longer have company-sponsored health care. We're hearing this over and over again. I talked to one man who has a successful startup business. He got to 42 employees, and he said, and I quit growing because I did not want to get to 50, because not only am I concerned about Obamacare, but the cost of Obamacare, but I don't know how it's going to be implemented. I don't know the rules of it. So I would say this debate is well worth having, and I would say to our Democrat friends, whether you voted for it or not, at this point it's not a matter of philosophy, it's a matter of admitting that it is a mistake to go on with Obamacare. It has not decreased the cost, and it has not increased the access of health care. And before we say goodbye to the best health care system in the world and 1/6 of our economy, turning it over to the federal government, we need to stop and retool and start all over. So it is the right thing to do to fund the government, avoiding a shutdown, but not to fund Obamacare. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from New York.
I just want to thank my friend, the gentleman, Mr. Kingston, for making a good case for the Affordable Care Act. You want to turn it back over to the insurance companies who are raising these rates in your district and my district. And I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as a member of the House Appropriations Committee, I rise in opposition to this, the 43rd attempt to defund, delay, or undermine the Affordable Care Act by House Republicans. What is even more disturbing is that this latest attempt comes with the very distinct possibility for a costly and disruptive government shutdown. As members of Congress, we have a constitutional obligation to fund our government. The Senate sent us a bill yesterday that would accomplish that goal. But rather than pass it, House Republicans are pressing their ideological agenda once more, pushing us closer to a government shutdown. Look, I get it. The Republican caucus is desperate to halt the Affordable Care Act because they bet against it, and they came up short. But now they're gambling with our entire economy. They're desperate because they bet against a law that is already benefiting millions of Americans, from seniors on Medicare to children with pre-existing conditions to millions of Americans who were being overcharged by their insurance companies. And starting January 1st, millions more uninsured Americans will be able to obtain quality, affordable health insurance. In fact, just this week, it was announced that a family of 4 in my congressional district, making $50,000 a year, would be able to obtain private health insurance for as little as $24 a month. The Affordable Care Act is working, and I urge my colleagues to stop betting the same losing hand on our economy. Enough already. Let it go. Now, let me tell you something, that your little stunt that you're pulling here, which has no chance of becoming law, what it does for the millions of breast cancer survivors like me. 95 days from today, the millions of survivors, the 150 million people who live in this country with a pre-existing condition, you are trying to rob us of the peace of mind that that provision gives us. What you're trying to do is make sure that every single day when each of us who survived cancer or another life-threatening illness, waiting for the other shoe to drop, what you're trying to do is say, you should stay living in fear for an insurance company to boot you off your insurance because of the possibility of you getting sick again. It's unconscionable. It's unacceptable. Walk a mile in our shoes.
Time of the gentlelady has
I yield
expired.
back.
I would remind members they should address their remarks to the Speaker of the House. Chair. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire the time remaining?
From Kentucky has 16 minutes, and the gentlelady from New York has 20 3/4 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to a very important member of the Ways and Means Committee of the House, Mr. Paulson of Minnesota.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all know that the medical technology industry is one of America's leading manufacturing industries and has huge potential to continue being a vehicle for creating jobs. This American success story employs more than 400,000 workers, pays salaries 40% higher than the average national wage, is one of our country's few industries that actually exports more than it imports. And it is an industry that is fueled by innovation and is made up of mostly small businesses. 80% of these businesses have less than 50 employees. 98% of them have less than 500. Most importantly, however, this is an industry that saves and improves lives for patients. Medical devices help slash the death rate from heart disease by a stunning 50% and cut the death rate from stroke by 30%. But, Mr. Speaker, last January, a new $30 billion medical device tax was enacted as a part of Obamacare. It's not a tax on profit. It's a tax on revenue. It's a tax on sales. Nobody can explain why this industry was singled out, other than tens of billions of dollars needed to be brought in to pay for an over $1 trillion law. But you know what? The effects have been devastating. 10,000 job losses across the country have been announced. Companies are moving their operations overseas, and once these jobs move overseas, they don't just come back. Countless small, privately held companies, they've cut jobs and investment in research and development to deal with this onerous policy. And research and development is the very lifeblood of this industry. I have a letter, Mr. Speaker, from 975 organizations in support of repealing the device tax. 975. The signers include the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, numerous doctors and physicians and healthcare groups that are directly impacted by the tax. I'd ask unanimous consent to include it in the record, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, we know this tax is bad policy. We know there is support in this chamber and in the Senate to repeal this tax. Last year, the House passed the repeal legislation with overwhelming bipartisan support, but the Senate didn't act before the end of the year. But this year, we have 263 co-sponsors of legislation to repeal this tax. 263, far more than last year and more than enough to pass it in the House. And last April, when the Senate was debating their budget resolution, 79 senators voted their intention to also repeal the device tax. 79 senators, and 33 of those senators were Democrats. Mr. Speaker, how often do we have such an overwhelming bipartisan majority and support on such an issue. This is our opportunity. Winston Churchill is to have said that people occasionally stumble over the truth, but most of them pick themselves up and hurry off as if nothing ever happened. The truth that we all know about the medical device tax is that it has destroyed jobs, it's destroyed innovation, and it has hurt patient care. These are the very pillars that the health care law reform was actually supposed to support. Repealing this policy sends a very strong and common sense message to the American people that Congress may not always agree on what is the right path forward, but we can absolutely recognize when a policy has set us on the wrong path, and today we have an opportunity to right this wrong. This amendment repeals a tax that is threatening America's global leadership and innovation. This is about saving lives. It's important that we do act now and today. Let's stop the job losses. Let's protect these high-wage jobs. And let's ensure that America continues to invent, continues to innovate, and continues to develop the very cutting-edge and life-saving technologies for our patients. Vote for the repeal of the medical device tax. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Fattah.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady. I've been here for 10 terms, and I've seen a lot. I was here when most of the members of my party voted against the prescription drug program offered by the other team. And President Bush pushed it through. It created a $7 trillion hole in the budget. Wasn't paid for. But after we won the majority, we won the presidency, we didn't go back to try to undo it. We actually worked to fix it a little bit. We got rid of the donut hole, and we embraced it and moved forward. There seems to be a problem on the other side. They don't seem to want to come to grips with the fact that the game is over, that the teams have left the field, and that this question about the Affordable Health Care Bill is settled law. That is to say that this consistency would be admirable, except it's somewhat of a kind of foolish consistency to come 40-plus times attempting to delay or to repeal the Obama Care Act, as they refer to it. Doesn't make any sense. We're not in negotiations with the president. We're trying to pass a bill that the Senate will pass. And the Senate has made it clear that they have no intention of retreating or equivocating 1 inch on this matter. So all we're doing is spinning our wheels. So to delay health care, I would say is this. Health care delayed is health care denied. And our country, after some 90-plus years, multiple presidents have come to a conclusion that when there are Americans who need access to health care, that there's going to be a way for them to get it. Those exchanges are going to open on October 1, no matter what we do. And the majority needs to speak a little hard truth in the mirror to itself on this matter. The sooner, the better.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent, who is the Vice Chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations. Mr. Dent.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to say very clearly, I certainly oppose shutting down the government. I certainly oppose defaulting on this country's obligations. We have an obligation to govern, and I take that very seriously. I do support the underlying bill under consideration here today, specifically because of the repeal of the medical device tax, which in my district is real. The medical device tax is stifling innovation, it is costing us jobs, and it is raising costs, which unfortunately appears to be the health care law trifecta: raising costs, stifling innovation, and destroying jobs. Specifically, one company in my district with nearly 2,000 employees said that there are no raises for their employees because of this tax this year. Another small company called me up. The owner said, you know, he makes prosthetic limbs for many folks, including troops who come back from the wars, and said, you know, we've been in business for 100 years. We have a little over 50 people. We're probably not going to make it because of this. They need our help. They're crying out for help. Look, I understand we have to keep the government open, But we know that the Senate, 79 senators, are on record in support of repealing this tax, Republican and Democrat, states from Minnesota to Massachusetts to New Jersey to Pennsylvania. This is a very big deal. We need to do it. I also know there's a delay of the law in this bill, and I fully expect that when this is sent over to the Senate will likely pull that out, but they'll likely seriously consider the medical device tax. Let's get that done. It's imperative for us to do so. Again, so many people's livelihoods are dependent upon this. We make things in this country. We make medical devices in this country, and we ought to make sure that we don't do anything to harm them. Many of these manufacturers are going to be moving operations overseas. We know this. Let's not let it happen. America has an advantage in this area. Let's try to maintain it. A 2.3% on the tax is really harming these small startup companies that need access to capital. It's going to be much harder for folks. I could take you to the University of Pennsylvania and show you startups who are helping us deal with concussions, who are not going to be able to bring their product to market. At this point, I'd again ask for support of the bill, and I yield back my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished whip from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland, the minority whip, is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. The gentleman from Georgia said that this health care was about 1/6 of the economy. He's right. This continuing resolution is about 100% of the economy. Why are we here, Mr. Speaker? The American people are asking themselves, what is this debate about? We passed a budget in this House setting spending at $967 billion. The Senate passed a budget at $1.058 trillion. There's a $91 billion difference between the Senate and the House. This House, which talks about negotiations, has refused to go to conference. So we have not reached an agreement on a number. That's why we're here. Nor have we passed 2/3 of the appropriation bills through this House. In fact, one was brought to the floor and pulled off the floor because at the $967 billion Republican budget, you cannot pass those appropriation bills if there were no Democrat in the House. And my friend Mr. Rogers knows that. My friend Mr. Rogers talked about responsibility. We ought to be responsible. And I believe that on the Republican side of the aisle, there are at least 150 members who believe that we ought to be responsible, that believe that this constant harping on the Affordable Care Act, which was the central part of the last election, and you want to deny the fact that elections make a difference. And one of the speakers got up and said, this mandate is unconstitutional. So he also wants to deny the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States has specifically said it is constitutional. But it doesn't comport with your view, and therefore you reject it as you have rejected the results of the election. Mr. Speaker, as the representatives of 316 million Americans, we have a special obligation to see past the politics of the moment and embrace the spirit of cooperation for the sake of the public good, not our good, not our politics. Not a single one of us is here because we were thought to be the best at doing nothing or saying no. Each of us was sent here because our neighbors believe we have something positive to contribute, that we can do what is right for our country. May I have one additional minute? Not for our politics, but for our country and for our people. We have a matter of days, but hours left to prevent our government from shutting down. A shutdown is not a tactic. It's not a strategy. It is a failure for this country. Let us not be the country whose representatives cannot work together to fulfill the most basic function of government. My friends across the aisle voted over 40 times to derail the Affordable Care Act without success. When do you say enough is enough? Let us move on responsibly to make government work. At, by the way, your level. The President has said he would sign a bill at your level, not a negotiated level, at your level. You've won, but you can't take yes for an answer. The Senate rejected it, as they will reject this new attempt. Instead, now is the time to try a different approach. Mr. Speaker, it is time to let this House, and not just a small faction of the House, can I have 30 additional seconds?
The gentleman's recognized.
Which I tell my responsible friends on the Republican side of the aisle, you ought to reject. You ought to say enough is enough. You ought to say let's move on. You've had your votes. We lost. Let us live up to the responsibility that our founders instilled in this great people's house and continue to be the democracy that is the envy of the world. Let us make sure that when people look at America, they look at America as a country that works, at America that can be united, at an America that believes e pluribus unum still is our motto. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman has expired, and the chair would remind members to address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves his time. The gentlelady from New York.
I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Levin.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I urge we need to pause to consider the real meaning of what's happening tonight. This is more than about a vote or two. I think this is a fateful occasion. It signifies this: the Republican Party in the House is being thoroughly radicalized. There are Republicans cheering as the U.S. ship of state goes over the cliff. A House Republican colleague of ours said this, is reported today: I do believe Republicans will be blamed. There are some, I think, who would relish a showdown. I think that's unfortunate. It's worse than unfortunate. It's historically reckless and radical. This is an eventful and, I think, shameful night for the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlelady from New York.
I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished leader of the Steering and Policy Committee of the House of Representatives, Mr. Andrews.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Imagine you lived in a town where the mayor and the council were fighting over a tax increase or the budget. And the mayor of the town said, if I don't get my way, I'm going to stop paying the police department, close the schools, turn off the street lights, and not pick up the trash. That mayor would get recalled by the end of the week. That's what the Republican majority is doing to the country here tonight. They made it very clear they don't like the Affordable Care Act. 46 times they voted to repeal it. Now they're saying something a little different. They're saying to the country, you can either have a budget that makes the country run without the Affordable Care Act, or you can't have a country with a budget that runs. This is not the way to legislate. This is not the way to do the people's business. We should have the Senate bill on the floor and vote on it. This will surely cause a shutdown of the government. It is an outrage. It is an abandonment of responsibility, and all members should oppose these amendments so we can keep this government open. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky.
I yield 1 minute, Mr. Speaker, to the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks.
The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise today in support of this amendment. When the Affordable Care Act was passed, I am certain that the other side did not intend that so many jobs would be lost. Over 10,000 device jobs have already been lost or announced lost in this country. The tax on medical innovation in place since the beginning of this year has already killed these jobs. Jobs like 1,700 Abbott Labs, 2,400 announced Boston Scientific, 300 to 400 in my state, Cook Medical in Indiana, 200 Hillrom, Medtronic, 1,000 jobs lost, Zimmer 450. 20,000 Hoosiers are employed by the medical device industry in Indiana, many all across the country. The average wage is $60,000. This tax can result in a loss of over 45,000 jobs nationwide. And it is hurting people with diseases. And these innovations that these companies produce help save lives. They do help people with their diseases and with their debilitating things that are happening with their bodies. It's not an exaggeration to say that this tax has deadly results. And so for months, I've heard there's bipartisan support. Where is it? Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield.
Gentlelady from New York.
I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellis.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this bill shuts down the government. The Senate passed a clean CR. We could take it up right now. We could pass it, and we could keep the government open. But if we do something to change this Senate bill and we amend it and send it back, the time that would be needed to avoid a shutdown would be gone. And so, no matter what your views are on these amendments, a vote for them is a shutdown. Make no mistake about it. And the Republican majority knows this. They're well aware, and what they're doing is designed to shut down the government. They're shutting it down, and the only question before the American people now is, will they continue to tolerate this kind of behavior? We are here to govern. We're here to look after the American people. We are here to make sure that the full faith and credit of this government maintains, and not just in a financial sense, but in a mental sense. People have to believe in us. And when they shut this government down, they do something fundamental. They shake the confidence of this nation. It's wrong. We should oppose it. Vote no on all these amendments.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I've been listening to this debate, and we are not coming to grips with what the central issue is. The bottom line is we understand that on this side we have people who believe the Obamacare legislation will be very detrimental to the people of the United States. We have people on this side of the aisle who believe it will be very good for the people of the United States. So, how do we work this out in a democratic process? We try to find a compromise. This bill is not about whether Obamacare is going to come in or not. What we're voting on is whether or not you will accept the compromise which we have reached out to offer to say, look, there's apprehension in the private sector, and the government people tell us they aren't even ready to enforce Obamacare. Let's postpone it for a year. That's what this vote is all about. Will you accept the compromise? If this government shuts down, it's because you have not accepted the compromise that Republicans have reached out to you and offered. We have to understand, in this democratic process, it's not like the president says, there will be no negotiations. No negotiations. He'll negotiate with foreign dictators before he will negotiate with us. We have reached out with a compromise. Please accept the compromise and keep the government open.
It has expired. I would once again remind members to address their remarks to the chair. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Let's say exactly what this is. This is about a shutdown being ordered by the Republican Party. It is your initiative. And the reason for that is because you have been hijacked by a small group of extreme folks who simply hate this president. That's all that this is about. And the American people reject it because we had the election and the majority of the American people elected President Obama. And you hate that when you see that because, shake your head if you want to, you cannot separate Obamacare from the President of the United States. It's one and the same. You're the ones that are offering the shutdown.
We'll suspend. Now, I have said, the chair has said on at least 3 occasions, you address the remarks to the chair. I would advise the gentleman to address his remarks to the chair.
I will, Mr.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson hated each other so much. But that hate that they had for each other did not come before the love of their country. And your hate for this president is coming before the love of this country, because if you love this country, you would not be closing it down.
The time of the gentleman has expired, and once again, I would ask members to address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my remarks will change, Mr. Speaker, based on the last remarks that were just given. I think it's important that we do not challenge in this chamber the love that each member here has for their country. Many of us have made great sacrifices to represent the people, Mr. Speaker, that we were elected to represent. And to question that is certainly looking at history with a very myopic view. Because if we were to blame this just on the Tea Party or some extreme group, we would be ignoring history. Because this government has been shut down 17 times, Mr. Speaker, and 13 of those times it was when a Democrat was in that chair. And I think it's clear that we have to make sure that under Tip O'Neill that it was shut down more than anybody else. And it's important, Mr. Speaker, that we make sure that it's clarified tonight. One other clarification. The motto behind you, Mr. Speaker, is not what was put forth by the whip from the other side. It says, "In God we trust." And with that, I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker and my colleagues, the Republicans would not work with us and figure out how Obamacare should meet the needs of the American people. But it was passed into law. The courts approved it. The electorate voted and approved the president who supported it. And now the Republicans say they're offering a compromise? Their compromise would deny people health care because of pre-existing conditions for a year, make sure that people can't afford health care, can't get it for a year, but it does worse than that. It takes people on Medicare and keeps them from getting the break on their prescription drugs and their doctors from getting the increase in reimbursement for their services. It would stop the expansion of Medicaid for very low-income people. This isn't just postponing it. It is undercutting the Affordable Care Act. And the tax provision on medical devices will only widen the deficit. Their provision will cost us money. And if they shut down the government, it will hurt a lot of people, not just government employees, but people all across the country. Reject this Republican proposal, and let's approve funding for the government.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Waxman just got up and eloquently spoke about the need to keep these insurance reforms in place, particularly about pre-existing conditions. And let me just say, I would encourage him to read the bill, and it does that. What the bill, in fact, does is it says that those reforms that were in place in the provisions of Obamacare prior to 1 October, the insurance reforms will remain in place, and the rest of it will, in fact, be delayed. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Gentlelady from New York.
I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal.
The gentleman from Massachusetts recognized for a minute. Without objection, so ordered.
The job killer that we're threatening tonight has nothing to do with the medical device tax. It has to do with us giving up our responsibilities. The idea that we would threaten the full faith and credit of the United States is the issue that's in front of us. We negotiated that medical device tax. It was originally proposed at 5%. We cut it to 2.3%. In addition to which, based upon an industry request, we extended it to foreign competition. Now, an issue that's been conveniently left out of this discussion is who's the biggest purchaser of medical devices? Medicare. By expanding the Affordable Care Act, we're going to have more customers who are going to purchase more medical devices. That's the reality actuarially of what we're discussing tonight. This notion that you can separate the revenue portion from the overall legislation is ill-considered, and everybody knows it. This was negotiated in full light of day, thoroughly discussed. Return to the argument I made a moment ago. If you're interested in not killing jobs, stop this ruse that you're playing on the American people tonight, and with the full faith and credit of the United States, with the debt obligations that we have.
The gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, sometimes I wonder if we're discussing the same bill. This is a bill that is to keep the government open. And I look at the Affordable Care Act. You know, the President made a guarantee, a simple guarantee. If you like your health care plan, you can keep it. You know, when I go to a store and I buy a product and it comes with a guarantee and it doesn't work, you take it back, you get your money back, and you look for a new product. People are losing their health care plans. Now is the time to take some time for what would be bipartisan health care reform, not a bill that was rammed through on a party line vote so that we could pass it to find out what's in it, and the American people are finding out what's in it. It's time for a new product. It's time for bipartisan health care reform, and I ask for the folks across the aisle to come together and let's do something that empowers the American people and not the elites at HHS here in Washington, D.C. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from New York.
I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the distinguished ranking member. Mr. Speaker, for people who are tuning into this debate, I want to make sure there's no confusion. This is not Saturday Night Live. This is the Republican majority at work, only they're not working. It is a game. It is a game that they have played since day one. This has been the Congress of chronic chaos since day one. And tonight is just another episode, my colleagues, of that Congress of chronic chaos. Forget Saturday Night Live, Mr. Speaker. When I grew up on Long Island, I used to watch one of my favorite cartoons, The Roadrunner. Remember The Roadrunner, Mr. Speaker? Every episode, another cliff. They have turned governing, Mr. Speaker, into an old cartoon of The Roadrunner. This is not a game. The American people deserve better than this. This is not about the Affordable Care Act, Mr. Speaker. This is not about Obamacare, Mr. Speaker. This is about whether we govern. This is about whether they are willing to hold this economy hostage to their ideology. This is about whether they are willing to put people out of work because of their extremism. And they use the Affordable Care Act as a subterfuge. Mitt Romney said they're going too far. Karl Rove said they're going too far. The Chamber of Commerce said they're going too far. The Wall Street Journal said they're going too far. And what are they doing tonight? Going farther.
doubling down. The American people have gone from deep disappointment in this dysfunctional majority to absolute outrage with this dysfunctional majority. Mr. Speaker, the American people who are watching this and watching this Congress want reasonable leaders with reasonable solutions and common sense ideas for this country. Not shutdowns, not showdowns, not cliffs, not chaos, not cartoons, which we get tonight and which we have gotten every single night since this majority became the majority. When this government shuts down because of them, Mr. Speaker, Americans are going to have to continue to pay their taxes.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman
Thank you,
from
Mr.
Kentucky.
Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Culberson, who's the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Milcon and VA.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker. As we say in Texas, it's time to get a few things straight around here. We have, in the House of Representatives, passed a Defense Department appropriations bill back in June. We passed a military construction VA appropriations bill to make sure our veterans are taken care of back in June. We passed legislation to protect our homeland, Department of Homeland Security's fully funded, everything the President asked for, everything the agencies asked for, passed out of the House early this summer. We even passed an energy and water appropriations bill. They are sitting in the Senate and could have been passed back over here very, very easily because the Senate's been known to move like lightning when they need to. They can move, they've even deemed bills before they've passed. Yet, in the democratic process, all of us have learned ever since elementary school that the democratic process requires compromise. Two sides that disagree find a way to come closer together. The President of the United States, for the first time today, since 1979, the President of the United States reached out to the dictator in Tehran, who has sworn to erase Israel from the map. The President of the United States will talk to the dictator of Tehran, but he won't even negotiate with the House of Representatives, with a majority that was elected by our constituents to do everything in our power to delay, defund, or stop Obamacare. The last time we sent this bill to the Senate, it was a complete and total defunding Obamacare. Stopped it cold. Well, we've compromised, as the democratic process requires. Tonight, we offer the Democrat minority a compromise. Let's just delay it for a year. Let's give the nation a chance to see what's in that 2,500-page bill that Nancy Pelosi had no idea what it was at the time she said, we have to pass the law before to find out what's in it. We're discovering every day new horror stories. The American people deserve to have time to see what this monstrosity will do before it is implemented. Every day that we are simply offering a compromise of a year's delay. We're even fully funding the troops. Another compromise. And that's the way it works in the democratic process, but it's hard to do with people that won't even talk to you. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
We're just 2 days away from a Republican government shutdown. Now, you can try to deny it, but you're going to have to wear the jacket. NBC News, the Fiscal Times says it's going to cost $150 million a day to shut down the government. The Chicago Tribune says the National Park Service would close all 401 national parks. Approximately half the government civilian workforce, about 1.2 million employees, is expected to have furloughs. The Washington Post said the Department of Veterans Affairs told congressional officials late Friday that all benefit checks and issues, including disability claims and pension payments, will be disrupted if a government shutdown lasts for a while. ABC News talks about suspension of approval of applications for small business loans and medical research interrupted. And the Wall Street Journal has a warning, too. It says some Republicans think they're sure to hold seats in the House in 2014, no matter what happens because of gerrymandering. But even those levies won't hold if there's a wave of revulsion against the GOP. Marginal seats still matter for controlling the Congress. The kamikazes could end up ensuring the return of all Democratic rule.
Gentleman from Kentucky.
Might I inquire of the time remaining, Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman from Kentucky has 3½ minutes remaining, and the gentlelady from New York has 5 minutes remaining.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves his time. The gentlelady from New York.
I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Lee.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I'd like to announce breaking news. I thank the gentlelady from New York. Texas happens to be a very diverse state. And my good friend from Texas just stood up and made an absurd proclamation, absolutely absurd, coming from a state where there are 6 million plus uninsured individuals. He knows full well that tonight when we vote to shut down the government, he will in fact also eliminate the Affordable Care Act, not delay it. What he will do is he will then tell those who have a pre-existing disease that the law is delayed. He will tell children who need preventative care, the law is delayed. Further, he will tell our creditors that we are irresponsible as a country, and he will tell the American people whose jobs depend upon the government operating that you don't count. I don't want to live in a nation where someone can say to the nation and say to the people that you don't count. I have said it before, I'm saying it again. When we vote tonight, we will be voting to shut down the government. You'll be voting to ignore the states and the responsibilities of this country in paying its debt, and you will then say to those who believe in the fact that the government stays open,
the gentlelady will suspend. Her
my
time
friend
has
does not
expired.
have the facts, and we are shutting down the government tonight. I yield back.
Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore.
The gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, be not deceived. The people are not mocked. In 24 hours, if we don't send an exact bill back to the Senate, not a colon, not a semicolon, not a paragraph, not a word different, the government will shut down. This debate is not about medical devices, about birth control, about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. It is about continuing to have our government operate for another few days. And if we don't send a bill, we have 24 hours for this Congress to agree on the exact bill. And I agree with my other colleagues. This whole debate is a subterfuge and a proxy for a strong desire to bring this nation to its knees and to punish the people for electing Barack Obama President of the United States. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves his time. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you.
Soon the government of the world's greatest country will shut down. It will reopen. Only when the public decides that one party is uncompromising and unreasonable. A CR sets our spending level. This CR sets the spending level right there at the Republican Ryan budget level. $250 billion below the President's request, $72 billion before Senate Democrats. When it comes to spending levels, we have compromised. It is manifestly unreasonable to say you're going to shut down the government to achieve a legislative objective? What if Democrats said, we're going to shut down the government if we don't get immigration reform, gay rights, or gun control? We are as passionately dedicated to those issues as our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are to their ceaseless desire to repeal Obamacare. But we will not shut down the government. We will not destroy the American economy to get our way. We will not take hostages. We will prevail when we persuade Republicans or elect Democrats. We will not hurt this country to get our objectives. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this discussion tonight reminds me of a courtroom scene with Jack Nicholson and A Few Good Men. The truth, you can't handle the truth. Mr. Speaker, we have shown the other side how premiums are going up, 200% to 300%. We've told them about the loss of jobs, that we lost full-time jobs. The unions don't like it. We've lost innovation. We have enormous tax increases. They just don't hear it. But, Mr. Speaker, the American people, they're not a lemming, and they don't want to follow the lemmings going off the cliff. Mr. Speaker, it's time that we recheck this and stop this crazy, delusional idea that nationalized, centralized planning will work. I yield back my time.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
The lady has 2 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Kentucky has 2.5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, my friend Mr. Rogers and I have been trying to pass a bill that would reflect the needs of the people of the United States of America. My friends know that this bill is just delusionary. It just reflects the dysfunction of my friends on the other side of the aisle. To allow the extreme wing of the Republican Party to control this debate does not make sense at all. The truth is, we are 2 days away from a shutdown. My friends know that this bill is not going to be accepted by the Senate. They sent over a bill that we could have all passed, sit down and work together, and keep this government from shutting down the dysfunction that is occurring because of the Republican wing of the party does not make sense to me at all. You're bowing to the extremists, the Tea Parties, who really don't want to see this process move forward. We know that the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. We know it's been affirmed by the Supreme Court of the United States. Let's move on. Let's not waste time. People are out of work. Children are not getting what they need in school. The National Institutes of Health is not getting the resources that they need. Let's stop this game. Let's stop the dysfunction. Let's stop playing game. This is a reality. Let's work together and pass a bill, a continuing resolution, and then I'm sure Chairman Rogers and I could pass an omnibus bill with the Senate to move forward with the work that we are elected to accomplish.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard time and again tonight from the other side that this debate and vote is about shutting down the government. Well, pardon me. I thought we were voting on a continuing resolution. What do you think a continuing resolution is? It's to continue the government. Now, those on the other side also want to say that we're defunding Obamacare. We're not. We did that in the first bill we sent over to the Senate. The Senate rejected that, sent it back. Now, this side of the aisle is offering a peaceable offer. People all over this country are telling all of us how much they are worried about this Obamacare that they're having to contend with starting this Monday. They're saying, please give us a break, give us some time to adjust to this. Even the President admitted that the law was not for prime time for the business community, and he gave them an extra year, businesses. He's excused so many other people that we don't even know about. And yet the individual mandate, the requirement of the law that individuals must comply with, he will not yield on. Well, that's what this bill does. It says, let's take a year off and let's work this thing. Let's get the computers working, which they're not working now. Let's get the computers working right. Let's get the staff in the field. Let's get people out there who can sign people up. And that takes time, Mr. Speaker. And that's what this bill is all about. It says delay for just 1 year the individual mandate, which is really all that's left that's still in force. Let's take a year and perfect, if you can, this bill for the individual. But to say that what we're after tonight is to shut down the government is just not so. This is a continuing resolution. This continues the government, like it or not, but that's what it does. And so I urge a yes vote. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. All time for debate is expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 366, the previous question is ordered. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of the motion offered by the gentleman from Kentucky is postponed.
What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 366, I call up the bill H.R. 3210, a bill making continuing appropriations for military pay in the event of a government shutdown, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3210, a bill making continuing appropriations for military pay in the event of a government shutdown.
Pursuant to House Resolution 366, the bill is considered read. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Kingston, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Kingston.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the consideration of H.R. 3210.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 3210 is called the Pay Our Military Act, and it's been introduced by Representative Mike Kaufman and Representative Louis Gohmert, along with a number of other members of Congress, and the purpose of it is to authorize the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Homeland Security to continue to provide pay and allowances without interruption to the 1.4 million members of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, the men and women who perform services during any potential funding gap. Without this action, their pay could be delayed. Our troops should not suffer for Washington's failure to act. As the representative of more than 35,000 troops who are in and out of war zones, I know that they and their families cannot afford to miss one paycheck. Regardless of what happens in politics, we as Democrats and Republicans should be able to come together and ensure that our sailors, soldiers, and airmen are all paid and paid on time. During the government shutdown in 1995, soldiers were paid because the Department of Defense had already been funded for the year. Their appropriation bill had already been passed by both houses and signed into law by the President of the United States. That is not the case today. Therefore, H.R. 3210 is essential. Not only would it pay our troops, but it would permit the payment of civilian personnel and contractors whom the Secretary determines are providing support to the members of our armed services. And, Mr. Speaker, I retain the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. Gentleman from Virginia.